Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and updated Beidou guide. In today's video, we're going to be covering everything you need to know about Beidou, a character who honestly has only gotten stronger as time passed. Not only has Beidou always been a strong burst DPS, but now with so many new characters that she synergizes with, as well as Dendro, which has been released since my last Beidou video, she is clearly solidifying her place as being one of the strongest 4-star characters that I think you should build, at least when you factor in how much damage she can deal with a correct build and team, which is what we're going to be talking about in this video. In fact, we're going to be covering everything that you need to know about Beidou, how to play and build her efficiently so that you guys can get the most value out of her. But first, thanks to the 7 Deadly Sins Grand Cross for sponsoring today's video. 7 Deadly Sins Grand Cross is an adventure-styled RPG game where you get to be the main character of 7 Deadly Sins. You can explore the grand world and story that this game has to offer with stunning graphics that look like watching a high-quality 3D animation. Enjoy a variety of content with the skill-based card battle system, using skill cards strategically to win your battles. The new update breathes a new life into the game with a new hero, the Ruler Tyrant Demon King, and a brand new Chapter 28. You can also pick up the new hero, Demon King, and existing characters, namely the 4 Archangels, Elite Demote, and Purgatory Meliodas. In addition, the other draw, Special Anniversary Thank You Draw, has a 7% rate of picking up the SSR character, which is really high with auto upgrade to UR level 90. You'll be rewarded with up to 242 free draws just by logging in and playing the game. This game is free to download using my link in the description, and it's a great time to play for both new and returning players during this huge new update. Thanks again to 7 Deadly Sins Grand Cross for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into it. Alright, so first things first, I want to talk about why Beidou is such a broken character, what she actually does, and how you should be playing her. Now keep in mind that since Beidou is an old character who's been out since the release of the game, and I have made other Beidou guides in the past, I want to give you guys just the advanced and basic information you should know, a summary of her kit without repeating the things you've heard a million times. And so what Beidou does is be an excellent electro burst DPS character who can be used from off field because of how her burst works, bouncing between enemies with every normal attack that you do on your active character. In fact, Beidou's elemental burst, Stormbreaker, will have 1 hit of electro damage around her and then have this sort of lightning joint attack alongside your active character's normal or charge attacks, which will create a lightning discharge that will bounce between enemies and dealing electro damage. On top of that, you gain resistance interruption and also some damage reduction, so you'll take less damage when inside of this burst, which is very relevant, but more on that later. But the main thing to note is that your elemental burst will do a lot of damage. Every single hit will create this discharge that will, at base level with no constellations, just the default ability, bounce between targets 2 times, which will make for 3 total instances of damage, assuming it's bouncing between at least 2 enemies, with an extra 2 jumps with your second constellation, which is super broken and we'll talk about in the constellation section, but a really huge increase in your damage, making each discharge bounce 4 times for 5 instances of damage on every single normal attack, where your burst can trigger a discharge, and you can trigger one every single second. Something to note is that the scaling of this ability is a lot higher than it seems because of how many times it's bouncing and how many instances of damage you're actually doing. I'll put some numbers from Kaching Mains on screen now showing the actual scaling of Beidou's burst in different situations, and you can see that based on how many times you're bouncing, Beidou's damage is really high. This is amplified by reactions such as Aggravate or with just her general synergies with some other characters, which makes it to where Beidou's damage and Beidou's teams are generally really strong, assuming you're fighting at least 2 or more enemies. In fact, if you're fighting even a large amount of enemies, being able to bounce between them will make it to where your Beidou's AoE is good, with her main strong suit and where she does the most damage being against exactly 2 targets, as each discharge of your burst will constantly be bouncing between 2 enemies non-stop. If you're wondering about how she performs in single target content, obviously yeah, that's her weakness. Her burst won't be able to bounce and you'll lose out on a lot of damage, but generally speaking, this isn't usually the biggest problem because first of all, a lot of the hardest content tends to be AoE or at least 2 or more enemies, and even if it isn't, even if you're fighting 1 boss, a lot of Beidou's best synergies, best teams are with characters that are really good in single target situations such as Fischl, Xingqiu, or even Yelan, who all synergize very well with Beidou, as we will see later in the video, and who are really good at covering Beidou's single target weakness. Beidou's burst is an energy cost of 80 with a 20-second cooldown, meaning you typically need a lot of energy or an electro battery, which is typically what I'll recommend, pairing Beidou with another electro character to help alleviate this high energy cost and make it something that you can definitely play around. Do keep in mind that Beidou's burst does snapshot, meaning that any buff you give it, like being inside of Bennett's burst and getting a ton of attack, will last for its entire duration, snapshotting from the moment you use it, so make sure you're buffed at the start of your burst so that these buffs will last for its entire duration, even if they were to otherwise expire. With that in mind, Beidou also has a very unique elemental skill, which you may know by now, which is her parry or counter ability, which you can tap or hold. If you tap this ability without thinking, you'll do a little bit of electro damage and get some particles, but if you tap it at the precise moment you're getting hit, or if you hold it and tank some hits, like 2 hits for its maximum stacking effect, then you will unleash a much more powerful blow that will also give you more energy. Because of that, you typically want to get a perfect parry parry if you can with your Beidou. Yeah, you could hold it, get a shield, some damage absorption, and then tank some hits and unleash it for the maximum amount of damage, or you could not waste any time at all and tap it as soon as you're about to get hit, which is a bit harder to time, but really worth it once you get the hang of it. Now, keep in mind though that sometimes this isn't consistent or isn't realistic. What I mean by that is, yeah, you do want to make sure you're getting a perfect parry to play Beidou optimally and to get as much energy and as much damage as you can. With that said, some enemies are just annoying or unpredictable and random at times, so sometimes you can think an enemy's gonna hit you press E, they don't, or an enemy just decides to look at you for 5 minutes instead of attacking you, and it can make Beidou feel a bit annoying to play if you're just waiting for a perfect parry. So my advice, as someone who has been playing Beidou for a really long time now, for pretty much every Abyss rotation, is to try to get a perfect counter if you think that it's feasible around the time you want to swap into Beidou, or to swap into her when you think an attack's coming. Whereas if not, just press your skill, as you'll see me do many times in the showcase, just to get the energy and not waste any time before using my elemental burst. Typically, you can do around 2 counters in a rotation, and a good average is to maybe try to counter at least one of those 2 parries to get more energy and more damage. Overall though, Beidou is really a super strong off-field burst damage dealer through her elemental burst, as I said, that has an insanely high scaling, provided you are fighting 2 or more enemies. Lastly, keep in mind that after using your parry, you will also gain some attack speed if you get a perfect counter, but generally this isn't the biggest deal. Do note that Beidou can also be used as an on-field auto attacker if no one else in your team can, and sometimes it can be fine. It can let you spam your skill more, it can enable sets like 4-piece Thundering Fury, which we'll cover later, but generally speaking, since most of her damage comes from her burst, she's a really great off-field option. That's her main role, a burst DPS or burst support, and you can use other powerful characters on field, a Hydra option like Ayato or Child, an Anemo one like Sucrose, a Dendro one like Nahida, or any good main DPS character you may be using who can synergize with Beidou. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how you actually want to build your Beidou to get the most value and damage out of her. This section is going to include her best artifacts, sets, and stats, but I believe it's important to start by talking about Beidou's best stats to get the commonly asked questions out of the way, namely how much energy recharge you need and the value of elemental mastery, whether it's better or worse than attack. First of all, I want to start by saying that Beidou's exact build will vary based on whether you play her in a Dendro team or in a non-Dendro team. With that in mind, for her artifacts at least, they generally will follow the same stat priority regardless of how you're playing her. In fact, the first thing you want is to get as much energy recharge as you need to spam your burst on cooldown. And while we'll cover the exact amounts in a little bit, just keep in mind that once you have enough energy recharge, after that, you're going to be focusing on crit rate and crit damage for the most damage from every part of your kit, and then looking for attack percent as the next best thing. Regarding elemental mastery, this stat is more or less relevant depending on how you play Beidou, but generally in a non-Dendro team, you don't really want EM because you're not doing a lot of reaction damage unless you're overloading or something, which isn't recommended. Whereas if you play her in a Dendro team, yeah, aggravate will increase in damage based on your EM, so you can get more damage out of your aggravates if you have elemental mastery, making it an okay substat, but it's not as good as crit or attack percent because Beidou's scalings are really high and she doesn't apply that much electro, which means that increasing the damage of her own hit will be better than increasing her reaction damage. Whereas with some other electro characters who apply electro a lot more fast but with less damage on each hit, elemental mastery can be similar to attack percent. So to not make this too confusing, basically crit and attack are just better than EM on Beidou, so I don't typically recommend going elemental mastery, but if you do play her in an aggravate or Dendro focused team, then EM on a substat can be perfectly fine and a decent stat to have. Now with that in mind, how much ER does your Beidou actually need? Because this is the most important thing. You want to use your burst as often as possible on cooldown because it is the vast majority of your Beidou's damage. Well, the exact amount of energy recharge you need will highly vary based on your team, but generally speaking, if you're playing an optimal Beidou team, which we'll talk about later in the video in the team section, you are going to be running Beidou, generally speaking, with another electro character, who can generate a ton of energy for you, allowing you to run on less energy recharge, with the general amount being around 140%. With that said, a lot of Beidou teams can need around 160 or 180%, depending on how you play her and what team comp you're running. So keep that in mind, as the exact amount of ER you need will vary heavily based on the team you're running and also how many parries you're hitting. Obviously, if you just tap your skill and swap out and don't get a perfect counter, you won't generate as much energy, as many electro particles, as if you were to get a perfect parry, which gives you more energy. Because of that, I personally recommend building a little bit more ER just to be comfy in case you miss a parry or aren't playing perfectly or the enemy is just unpredictable, as we saw. Then having extra energy recharge can really benefit you and make Beidou feel much comfier. With that in mind, the general range is 140 to 160 depending on the team you're playing, but with that said, the general ER amount that I recommend is around 140 in double electro teams, scaling up to 160 or 180 depending on how you play her. And after that, I highly recommend focusing on crit rate and crit damage being the best stats for you, with attack percent being the third best option, and then elemental mastery as a decent substat but not quite as good as the others. Once you have enough energy recharge though to use your burst on cooldown, then you want to be focusing on stats like crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. Because of that, for your main stats, you'll be looking for attack percent on the sands or energy recharge if you don't have enough. But generally speaking, attack percent sands, then you'd get ER from your substats and your set effect. Then you'll look for electro damage bonus on your goblet and crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, whichever one you need more of. Now with the stats out of the way, I think you can kind of tell what sets are going to be the best in slot on her, with the 4-piece emblem clearly being her best, as we saw as a character who relies on her burst damage and relies on having enough energy recharge to use her burst on cooldown, meaning that a set like emblem, which will give you 20% energy recharge, being the equivalent of 3 to 4 substats, and then increasing your elemental burst damage by 25% of your ER, is going to be absolutely huge, even if you're not running that much energy recharge. In fact, if you're running her on the higher end, like around 160 to 200% ER, then this set effect will give you an insane amount of damage. But even if you're running her on the lower end and only need around 140 energy recharge, this 4-piece emblem set will still be your best in slot, giving you more damage than the other sets, especially when you factor in the fact that the 2-piece gives you 20% ER, which is saving you from needing another 20% on your substats, allowing you to go for more offensive sets, which means that even in a situation where another set may give you a bit more damage percent, like for example the 4-piece Thunder Soother, if you don't need a lot of energy recharge, the emblem set will make up for it on its 2-piece by giving you free energy recharge on top of the incredible amount of burst damage that it'll give you, scaling up on your ER amounts. Do keep in mind though that even with the emblem set, you don't want to be building more energy recharge than you need. Just go for as much as you need or as much as you want to be comfy, but after that, going for excess energy recharge will not be as good for your damage as any of the offensive stats we mentioned earlier, namely crit or attack percent, meaning that it's not worth stacking too much ER just for the set effect. Offensive stats like crit or attack percent will still be a lot more valuable than going for too much energy recharge, assuming you don't need it. With that said, while the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate is your best in slot option, there are some other sets that can be comparable in strength, especially if you have better substats on them. You may want to use another set that you already have farmed, especially if your substats are good and you don't have a good emblem set. While I do recommend farming this domain, there are good alternatives like the 4-piece Thunder Soother if you have good electro uptime in your team, like for example an Aggravate Beidou team where the enemies can stay electro afflicted, giving you 35% damage, which is very nice. Other options include mix and matching 2-piece sets like 2-piece Thundering Fury, 2-piece Noblesse Oblige, or 2-piece of any of the attack percent sets, with all of these being pretty interchangeable in strength depending on your team and substats. More niche options include 4-piece Thundering Fury, but that's only ever going to be an option if you're playing Beidou on field and spamming her parry, which typically isn't how you're going to be playing her, but it can be viable. And also 2-piece of an EM set if you're playing her in Aggravate. It can be okay if your substats are really good, but again, this isn't as good as the other stats like attack or crit, so it's not as recommended. Generally speaking though, while the section might have seemed a bit complicated, it is very straightforward to build Beidou. For most people, you just want to go emblem with around 140 to 160 energy recharge or more depending on your team, then stacking attack percent and crit and going for a strong weapon, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. In fact, you'll be happy to know that Beidou has a lot of good weapon options for every type of player, and so that is what we're going to talk about right now, the best weapons for Beidou. Do note though that while I will include a weapon ranking and go through all of her best options, the exact strength of each weapon can depend based on how you play your Beidou. For example, if you have external buffs like Sucrose who gives you elemental mastery, Bennett who gives you a ton of attack, and whether you play her in an Aggravate team or a non-Aggravate team are all factors that can make a weapon better or worse for you, so I'll try to include as much detail as I can in this section while also giving you guys general recommendations. In fact, the most general recommendation for pretty much any Beidou is if you buy the battle pass, be sure to get the Serpent Spine. Now, while you shouldn't feel forced to get the battle pass as there are other options you can use, the Serpent Spine is generally speaking going to be not just her best 4-star option, but oftentimes her best option just in general, especially with the refinement. In fact, what the Serpent Spine does is give you crit rate on its stat, and then its effect will give you more damage as you stay on field, stacking up to 5 times. The total amount of damage you can gain from this if you have 5 stacks of the Serpent Spine active is 50% at R5, or still a strong 30% at R1, which is a lot of damage. This will snapshot onto your burst and give you just way more damage overall, as long as you make sure you have 5 stacks on your Beidou. On top of that, the Serpent Spine can be easy to stack up, as let's say you're in the Abyss, you can just wait a little bit before starting, having Beidou as the first slot in your team. You'll see these 5 stacks passively build up around you, and then you can start with a fully stacked Serpent Spine. Do note that with this weapon, you will take more damage though, and you lose a stack every time you get hit, but it's pretty easy with Beidou to just use your burst and then swap out, or dodge if you have to. With that in mind, the Akumaru is a 4-star weapon that is very similar in strength to the Serpent Spine. This is a weapon that gives you attack, and then a passive that increases your burst damage based on how much energy your team has, the combined energy cost of all of your party members, with a maximum of 40% burst damage from this passive at R1 and 80% at R5. Generally speaking, it's just a good 4-star gacha option if you get it from weapon banners. I know a lot of people don't have it, but if you do, it's about as good as Serpent Spine depending on your refinement and depending on what team comp you're running, with crit rate typically being more general, as it can make a good ratio a lot more accessible for you and will be better with buffs, whereas Akumaru can be better otherwise. Generally speaking though, these are two really good 4-star options that are about as good and sometimes better than her 5-star options, especially if these are refined and the 5-star isn't. In terms of 5 stars, Wolf's Gravestone is the generalistic go-to, with it being on par with the last two claymores I mentioned, usually a bit better than their R1 and a bit worse than their R5. Beacon of the Reed Sea, which is Dea's signature weapon, can actually be Beidou's best in slot as well if you chose to pull for it, being usually slightly better and on par with an R5 Serpent Spine because it gives you just a ton of stats, a high base attack, a lot of crit rate, and an effect that will give you 40% attack after hitting an opponent with your skill and taking damage. You can make sure to get these buffs before using your burst to maximize their duration, making this claymore your general best in slot 5-star. Other good options include most of the 5-star claymores. Redhorn Stormthresher gives you a lot of crit. It's not quite as good because its base attack is low and its effect sucks, but the crit makes it valuable, especially with someone like Bennett in your team. Skyward Pride is a great 5-star option if you need a lot of energy, whereas if not and you have enough on your artifacts, then it can be a bit wasted. Unforge is a pretty good stat stick for a bunch of attack, especially if you're shielded. And then for some other 4-star options, as obviously Serpent Spine and Akumaru aren't the most accessible ones if you don't buy the battle pass or don't pull on weapon banners, Beidou has some pretty good free-to-play options like the prototype Archaic, but actually better ones from events like the luxurious Sea Lord if you got that like about a year ago. So an old weapon but a good one as it gives you burst damage on its effect, and it's also a fish, which is just pretty cool. Or the Mailed Flowers, which isn't quite as good but is a bit better than the prototype Archaic if you are using her in an aggravate team, as it will give you elemental mastery and attack percent, 24% attack, 96 EM on top of the 110 that you get right here, making it a pretty decent option for aggravate as an accessible one from a very recent event. Other options include any ER one like the Favonius Greatsword, arguably Sack if you want to play her on field and parry more, Forest Regalia in some very specific Dendro teams, or even something like a Lithic Blade, which is a weapon that gets better based on how many party members you have from leeway and also its refinement. There are a lot of weapon options though, so I really don't want this part to get too confusing because I know I've talked about so many and it does depend on your playstyle. So I think the best way to show you guys what Beidou's best weapons are is by telling you that for most people, if you buy the battle pass, use Serpent Spine or Akumaru if you have it. Most 5-star claymores are also about as good, very similar in strength. And lastly, for free-to-play options, any of the 3 that I mentioned, depending on which ones you have, can be good. For more detail, I will now put 2 different weapon rankings on screen now that will show how good each weapon is for Beidou for 2 different teams. Again, there are many different ways to play her, and this can vary heavily based on your substats, rotations, and all of that. So keep that in mind, but this should give you guys a general idea of what's best for your Beidou based on your needs. All right, now moving on for Beidou's Constellations, as I mentioned earlier in the video, her second one is an absolutely huge power spike that I believe any Beidou player should go for. Now, this doesn't mean you can't play her at C0. She's still pretty decent, but definitely gets a lot better with her second Constellation, which is an amazing one overall. This second Constellation is part of what makes Beidou such a broken unit by significantly increasing the scaling of her burst overall, as each hit of your burst can jump 2 additional times. Even though this may be a bit misleading when you read it, 2 additional targets can actually be the same 2 targets even if you're just fighting 2 enemies. So as long as you fight 2 or more enemies, you will get way more damage from this burst. Now again, its exact value can depend, but overall it's just an insane constellation that I highly recommend going for, and that a lot of people might already have because Beidou's been out since the start of the game, since patch 1.0. Because she's such a old 4-star unit, this means that a lot of accounts, a lot of people might already have her constellations, and who is someone who is featured in the Star Glitter shop once every few months, and you can also get on banners. So there's a good chance that you have her second constellation or are going to be able to get it, which is one that I highly recommend for all Beidou players. If that wasn't enough, this constellation can also help you proc more reactions like aggravate, as you'll be hitting more times, effectively applying more electro while also dealing, as I said, way more damage. This should be your main goal, but with that in mind, there's also other good constellations, like even her first one just gives you a nice comfy shield on top of the damage resist that Beidou gives you, making her a very comfy support character to run in many different teams. I say support, although she can be like a DPS, but this shield is just really comfy. And then also her 5th constellation, increasing your burst talent level by 3 is really good since your burst has such a high scaling. Lastly, your 6th constellation will decrease the electro resistance of opponents by 15% during your burst. This is not just amazing for your Beidou's personal damage, but is also really good if you're running other electro characters like maybe a Fischl, Keqing, or Yai in your team, who can also benefit from the electro resistance tread that the 6th constellation will give you. And so overall, your 2nd, 5th, and 6th constellations are all really good ones to try to get, but your second one is definitely the most important and where Beidou really becomes such a strong character. Lastly, for the other 2 constellations, your C3 just gives you skill talent levels, and your C4 will give you a bit of electro damage to your normal attacks, with this constellation being especially relevant for an on-field Beidou, but if not, it's not that big of a deal. All right, now with all that out of the way, let's now talk about Beidou's best teams and also the best just character synergies that she has, so you can understand Beidou's true potential and build a team around it. Beidou is a character who can be used in pretty much any electro reaction, both with and without without Dendro. In fact, your best teams are typically the following. With Dendro, you typically play Beidou in an aggravate team, but can also use her as the last slot in a hyperbloom team, as she is not a character who will steal a lot of your hyperblooms, because Beidou doesn't hyperbloom much, allowing your other Electro or Anemo character like Sucrose to proc the hyperblooms without being afraid that your other Electro character, like maybe Official, might steal a few. This allows your character on full EM to proc the hyperblooms and your Beidou to do really good off-field Electro damage that you can also aggravate. For non-Dendro teams, she's typically played in an Electro Charge or Taser team, but there are some other reactions like Overload, which can be viable and we will get into, just not as generally recommended. Now, before we get into each one of these playstyles though, I want to talk about some characters that have good synergy with Beidou. First of all, usually when you play a Beidou team, while there are some where you can use her as the only Electro option, you typically run her with another Electro character, an Electro battery, and Fischl is generally the best option. Fischl is so good as a Electro unit in general, but also more specifically synergizes really well with Beidou because she has just an insane amount of not only Electro particle generation to give your Beidou a ton of energy and allow her to run on less energy recharge, but also really strong single target damage through Oz, her Ascension 4 passive, and also her Constellations if you do have them. Other Electro characters can work with Beidou, notably characters like Yae Miko, Keqing, even Kuki, or technically someone like Sara if you're playing like a lot of Electro characters in your team. Beidou can really synergize with a lot of these Electro characters. The one that she can't really synergize with, however, is going to be Raiden Shogun, because as I'm sure you know by now, Raiden's burst and Beidou's burst don't work together. When you use Beidou's burst and then Raiden's, Beidou's burst will simply not work and not fire any discharges, and the same can be said with Dea, whose hits inside of her burst are not considered normal attacks. With that in mind though, you can use Beidou with pretty much any other Electro character, but before we get into these specific teams, I did also want to mention that Beidou has really good synergy with a character like Xingqiu and also Yelan, but especially Xingqiu, because Xingqiu will apply a ton of Hydro from off field, dealing really good single target damage as well, and Yelan does that too, but Xingqiu will also give you some damage reduction and a little bit of healing through his rain swords, which can make you run healerless teams by having Xingqiu's damage reduction and Beidou's, and with high talents and also some of their constellations, which can give you added defensive utility like Beidou C1 and Xingqiu C1, you can get over 70% damage reduction while also having a little bit of healing, meaning that unless the Abyss is really hard like the current one, if you're running these two characters together in an offensive manner, you can oftentimes just not need a healer and get away with the insane amount of damage reduction that you're gaining. So this is just a bunch of general information, character synergies that I think I should get out of the way with Beidou, as it can help you build a team with that knowledge. But from there, we can now get into more specifics. Well, first of all, if you want to play Beidou with Dendro, the go-to team is going to be Aggravate, where you can use her with pretty much any Dendro or any Electro carry, as long as you're following the team formula. If you want to run an Electro on-field carry, like Sino, Keqing, or even Yae Miko, who can be your on-field auto attacker, then you can just pair Beidou there, and she's a really great option, provided you have a Dendro character and an Anemo character in your team, with one of them typically wanting to be a healer. Usually it's going to be your Dendro if you can, but also like a shield works. So as long as you have some form of defensive utility to stay alive, any of these Aggravate teams can work really well, and Beidou synergizes super nicely with a lot of these characters. On top of that, you can also run an Anemo driver in a team like this, where you're still aggravating a ton with any amount of Dendro, as the Quicken Aura will remain on enemies when you use Dendro and Electro on anyone. And then you can have an Anemo character constantly swirling Electro, giving you a ton of buffs through, for example, Sucrose's passive talents and the Verdescent Venerer set, while also being used as the on-field option, as all of her auto attacks can swirl. In a team like this, if you plan on using someone like Kazuha, you could also on-field with your Nahida, or on-field with a different Dendro character, as the sky can be the limit. In fact, if you want to play her with a Dendro carry in a more spread-focused team, you can do so with someone like Alhaitham, as Alhaitham and Beidou can have some pretty good synergy if you are playing a quickened team. Do keep in mind that if you're playing Hyperbloom though, Beidou is really only going to be an option if you have an extra slot available. So you're playing, let's say, Hydro, Dendro, and Electro, and then your last slot is a flex option, and Beidou is a really good one, especially in AoE situations or against like 2 to 3 enemies that group up for just a really nice amount of Electro damage. In this team, there are a ton of options you can do. There's really so many characters, but Beidou is definitely a great option, as she will not steal any of your Hyperblooms, or a very few of them, because as we saw earlier, her burst will not bounce to Dendro cores, meaning she won't Hyperbloom outside of the first hit of her burst and her parry. Because of that, Beidou can be a great last slot in any Hyperbloom team, while also being especially good in Aggravate with pretty much any other carry. If you want to play Beidou without Dendro, fear not, there's a lot of good teams too. Like even before Dendro came out, Beidou was great in Taser teams, also known as Electro Charge, with the traditional core being Beidou, Fischl, Xingqiu. If you want to run an on-field driver like Sucrose, and this is one of the best 4-star teams in the game, and it doesn't need a healer because of how much damage reduction you're getting, but you could also obviously use any on-field character here, like even an on-field Hydra option like Child or Ayato, who can both work really well in these Electro Charge teams. Lastly, feel free to use Beidou if you want an Electro option to superconduct in a physical team, like with Eula or Zhongli, but especially Eula. As well, Eula can have negative synergy with Beidou Beidou because of how long her burst animation is, Beidou is still such a strong unit that she makes up for it and is typically good in said team. You can also play Beidou in some overload variations with a pyro character, even though overload's not the best reaction against heavy enemies or just because of how high her scaling is, it can work out. You can also use Beidou with pretty much any carry that wants to normal attack, like genuinely, as long as you're proccing those discharges and are playing around the reactions that you're going to be proccing because she is an electro character, then Beidou can be a really good option for you. And lastly, instead of showing you guys a full Beidou showcase, because Beidou's an old character and also this video is getting very long, let's just show you some clips where she can really shine to show how strong she can be. First of all, in the current Abyss, when I was doing my 4-star only clear, I used Beidou in an aggravate team and fully utilized her burst to just absolutely carry me here when the enemies managed to group up. I applied Dendro to them to proc aggravate and also swirl electro with my anemo character, and then once they grouped up, as you will see very shortly, my Beidou just did so much electro damage. Basically, all of these numbers you're seeing are from Beidou and Fischl as well, but all of this is just aggravating, swirling, and just Beidou's sheer amount of damage carrying me through the Abyss. Beidou can also be good in content with even more enemies. Here is an example with a Hyperbloom team where, yeah, there's other characters doing a lot of damage like Nahida, Ayato, and the Hyperbloom reaction, but Beidou still does a lot of electro damage passively from off field here, being a great addition to the team who also won't steal many of your Hyperblooms. For another situation where Beidou can really shine, I bring you one of the most traumatizing Abysses, the last one, where there were waves of 2 enemies, perfect for Beidou, and I was playing an aggravate 4-star team again. And here, as you can see, as soon as I pop my Beidou burst and swirl electro, put Dendro on the enemies, and actually do manage to aggravate and keep the quicken aura onto all of them, I will just be destroying them with Beidou, despite it being one of the hardest and most annoying Abysses we've ever had. Really a piece of content where Beidou got to shine, and since we get Abyss rotations like this so often, where there are situations where Beidou is so good, I believe she's an invaluable character to invest into for your account as an amazing 4-star, especially if you have her second constellation. And so yeah, I really love Beidou, a super strong 4-star that you guys probably know by now I'm kind of obsessed with, at least power level wise. I think she's really strong. I also like her design, but I think she's just amazing in so many different teams when you need an electro burst DPS. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this guide was helpful, and as always, if there's anything you want to add, it will be in a pinned comment. I hope you enjoyed, I hope I helped, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.